Tell them to jump. The tower didn't shout it. They didn't need to. Everyone watching the sky could see the problem. The B-17 Flying Fortress was coming in crooked. The left landing gear hung half-deployed like a broken limb. The right gear never came down at all. One engine trailed a gray ribbon of smoke. The bomber tilted unevenly, fighting the air with a wing that looked peeled open by flak. On the runway below, crash trucks were already moving. Not to welcome a landing, to contain an explosion. Inside the B-17, the crew heard the order through static. Crew advised to bail out. The bombardier stared through the nose glass at the runway growing larger. The fortress shuddered with every vibration, aluminum skin trembling like the aircraft was arguing with gravity 1 second at a time. The co-pilot glanced at the pilot. "Gear's gone. She won't roll." The pilot didn't answer. His hands were welded to the yoke, eyes fixed forward. The bomber was bleeding altitude, bleeding speed. The ground was climbing faster than the instruments wanted to admit. The tower repeated it. "Recommend abandonment." The navigator unclipped his harness halfway, then froze. No one else moved. Every man inside the B-17 understood the math. Touchdown, wrong fuel, ignites wing catches. Fortress cartwheels crew erased outside. Ground crews stepped back from the runway edge. They expected wreckage. Inside the cockpit, the pilot finally spoke. "Sit tight." The runway filled the windshield. The crippled B-17 dropped lower, and the tower fell silent, waiting to watch a crash everyone believed was already decided. A B-17 Flying Fortress without landing gear isn't supposed to land. That's not pessimism, that's engineering. A fortress weighed over 50,000 pounds on return. Fuel still in the wings. Ammunition still in the bays. Aluminum skins stretched around a frame never designed to scrape concrete at speed. The landing gear wasn't optional equipment. It was the system that turned a falling bomber into something that could survive touching Earth. Remove it, and the aircraft becomes a sliding bomb. Metal grinds, sparks ignite vapor, wings shear, tanks rupture. The chain reaction doesn't give warnings. It finishes sentences instantly. Every man in the cockpit knew that. They'd walked past wrecked fortresses before. Aircraft that hit too hard. Aircraft that caught a wing. Aircraft that arrived almost safe and died in the last 50 yards. A gear failure didn't mean a rough landing. It meant probability shifting sharply toward fire. Yet this B-17 was still descending. On the ground, the tower tracked it through binoculars, already measuring the spread of impact. Foam trucks positioned where fire would roll, not where survivors would walk. No one below expected to tow that bomber away intact. They expected debris. Before aluminum meets runway, before the moment gravity decides whether the fortress survives, you have to rewind to when the aircraft was still whole, still loud, still just another returning bomber before a single burst of flak turned a routine homebound flight into an argument about whether to trust the machine or abandon it. Because bailout orders aren't dramatic gestures, they're verdicts. And this crew had heard theirs long before the runway appeared through the clouds. An hour earlier, the B-17 was steady, heavy, and confident. The Flying Fortress droned home in loose formation, sunlight flashing along aluminum wings scarred but intact. Bomb bay empty. Guns quiet. The crew's voices had returned to normal volume over the intercom, the subtle signal that men believed the worst part of the day was behind them. They were already thinking about the runway. Coffee. Debrief. Sleep. The flak burst came from below. It hit with a crack that ran through the airframe like a hammer striking a bell. The bomber lurched sideways. Warning lights snapped alive across the panel. The hydraulic needle dropped so fast, it looked pulled. "Hydraulics gone." The co-pilot tried the gear lever anyway. Nothing. The fortress didn't fall, but it felt different instantly. Heavy, sluggish. Like the air had thickened around it. Smoke curled back from the underside of the wing where shrapnel had ripped the skin open. The flight engineer dropped into the compartment, checked the lines, then came back pale. "They're shredded. We're not getting pressure back." Silence filled the intercom. Every man aboard understood what that meant. You could fly a damaged B-17 for hours. The fortress was famous for that. But landing was a negotiation, and they had just lost their strongest argument. The navigator broke the quiet. "We bail when we hit friendly ground?" No one answered right away. The pilot kept the nose level and pointed the wounded bomber toward home. The runway was still invisible beyond distance and cloud, but the decision was already forming in the cockpit like weather you could feel before you saw it. They were flying an aircraft that could not land normally, and every mile closer to base turned that fact into a countdown. By the time the airfield came into view, the B-17 was shaking itself apart. Not turbulence, fatigue. Every damaged panel vibrated at a different rhythm, turning the fortress into a machine arguing with its own survival. The controls felt delayed in the pilot's hands, like commands had to travel through pain before reaching the wings. Fuel sloshed unevenly in punctured tanks. The wounded engine coughed smoke in uneven bursts, threatening to quit every few seconds. The engineer kept calling numbers that drifted steadily toward the wrong side of safe. "If that engine dies," the co-pilot said quietly, "we're not making another pass." No one argued. The tower cut into their headsets. "Gear status?" The pilot answered flat. "Partial failure. We're coming in without it." A pause. Even through static, you could feel the runway crews moving. Foam trucks repositioning. Men stepping into suits built for burning aircraft. The ground wasn't preparing to welcome them. It was preparing to survive them. "Crew advised to bail out," the tower said. The navigator unclipped again. This time he stood halfway. The bombardier looked at the hatch. The decision wasn't theoretical anymore. The runway stretched ahead like a line they were being pulled toward. The wounded engine faltered. The fortress dipped hard enough to shove weightless silence into the cockpit. The propeller slowed, caught, spun again. The entire aircraft shuddered like it might tear open before touching Earth. They were running out of sky. The tower repeated it. "Abandon aircraft." Inside the cockpit, the pilot never turned his head. His hands stayed steady on controls that felt more like persuasion than authority. The B-17 lined up for final approach, and every witness, crew, tower, ground, reached the same conclusion without saying it. This landing would end in wreckage. The pilot pulled the power back with surgical care. Not enough to drop, just enough to settle. A B-17 without gear couldn't strike the runway hard. Impact meant sparks. Sparks meant fuel vapor. Fuel vapor meant the ending everyone was already bracing for. The only chance was to arrive slow enough that friction didn't become ignition. Too slow. Stall. Too fast. Fire. The safe number existed, but it was razor thin. "Hold tight," he said. The fortress crossed the runway threshold barely flying. The wounded engine gave a final cough and died. The propeller froze. The bomber sagged, heavy and silent, and its belly kissed concrete with a scream that tore the air open. Sparks exploded behind them. The crew flinched, waiting for the blast. It didn't come. The B-17 slid. Aluminum peeled away in a shrieking ribbon. The runway blurred past the nose glass. Smoke flooded the cockpit as paint and metal burned off the underside of the aircraft. Every man counted seconds, certain one of them would be the last. The pilot held the nose steady. Don't dig in. Don't catch a wing. Don't flip. The fortress ground itself smaller with every yard, a controlled disaster skating the edge of catastrophe. Foam trucks chased alongside, cannons aimed, waiting for the moment the bomber turned into a fireball. It never did. The slide softened. The scream faded. The aircraft shuddered once, twice, and stopped. Still upright. Still whole. For a heartbeat, no one inside moved. The silence after violence felt unreal. Like the crash everyone expected had happened in another timeline. The pilot released the controls slowly. They were on the ground. Alive. No one cheered. They listened, waiting for the explosion that was supposed to arrive late. The B-17 ticked and hissed around them, metal cooling, fuel dripping somewhere beneath the floor. Smoke drifted past the cockpit glass in lazy ribbons. Outside, foam crews drowned the runway trail in white spray, chasing a fire that refused to start. Nothing ignited. The pilot opened his hatch first. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean, and the crew climbed out one by one onto a runway carved open by their landing. When they turned back, the flying fortress looked impossible. Belly shredded, aluminum peeled like paper, landing gear hanging useless. one engine frozen mid-rotation. It should have disintegrated. Ground crews circled it slowly, touching the fuselage to confirm it was real. They weren't inspecting a crash site. They were standing around a machine that had crossed the line where survival ends and kept sliding anyway. The navigator laughed once, short, breathless, a sound a body makes when it realizes it's still alive. The pilot stood apart from the others, staring at the scar their bomber had carved into the runway. A bright metallic trail stretching behind them like proof of how close the ending had been. He didn't look triumphant. He looked temporary. Every man there understood the same quiet truth. The B-17 hadn't landed safely. It had landed barely. And the distance between those words was the space where they were still breathing. The Fortress would never fly again. But the crew walked away from a landing everyone agreed should have erased them. And in war, survival isn't victory. It's the moment the machine gives you back your life, instead of keeping it.